It was a dark and stormy night when I stumbled upon the most terrifying Craigslist post I had ever seen. It was a simple advertisement promising a free couch in good condition, but the words were written in a strange font that seemed to almost pulse on the screen. Despite my unease, I couldn't resist the temptation of a free piece of furniture, so I clicked the link and sent a message to the seller. Within minutes, I received a response with an address and instructions to come pick up the couch. As I made my way through the pouring rain to the seller's house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The street was deserted. The only sound was the pitter-patter of raindrops against the pavement. When I arrived at the house, I hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. The sound echoed through the empty house, but there was no response. I pushed the door open tentatively and stepped inside, calling out to the seller. There was no answer, but the musty smell of old furniture filled my nostrils. As I made my way through the darkened house, I realized that there were no other pieces of furniture besides the couch. The walls were bare, the floors creaking under my feet. I approached the couch cautiously, reaching out to touch the worn fabric. I sat down on it, and to my amazement, the couch was quite comfortable. I then noticed there were strange symbols carved into the wooden frame, symbols that seemed to writhe and twist before my eyes. Suddenly, the couch seemed to shift beneath me, and I realized that I was sinking into it. Panic set in as I struggled to free myself, but the couch seemed to have a life of its own, trapping me in its embrace. As I fought and struggled to break free, I heard a low whispering in my ear. It was a voice unlike any I had ever heard, deep and guttural and full of malice. "You are mine," it hissed. With a final burst of energy, I managed to free myself from the couch's grip and stumbled towards the door. But it was too late. The house had come alive around me, the walls closing in and the floor swallowing me whole. I woke up in a dark and musty room, my body aching and my mind reeling. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange objects, jars of eyes, mummified hands, and other unnameable horrors. As I struggled to make sense of my surroundings, the door creaked open and a figure stepped inside. It was the seller, but he looked different somehow. His eyes were dark and sunken, his skin pale and clammy. "It seems my magic powder had quite an effect on you," he said softly, his voice laced with madness. "Now you belong to me." With a scream of terror, I tried to run past him, but he was too fast. He grabbed me by the arm, his grip like steel, and dragged me towards a table covered in sharp instruments. "You will make a fine addition to my collection," he said, his eyes glowing with unholy glee. I struggled and fought with all my might, but it was no use. The seller was too strong, too relentless, and soon I found myself strapped to the table, a victim to his twisted desires. As he approached me with a gleaming knife, I closed my eyes and prayed for a miracle, but it was not to be. This real-life monster had claimed another victim, and I was lost to its dark embrace forever, or so it seemed. Days passed, and I found myself trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Every time I tried to escape, the walls closed in and the darkness consumed me once more. But one night, something changed. As I lay in my makeshift cell, I heard a faint whispering, a voice that seemed to be calling out to me from beyond the darkness. At first, I thought it was just a trick of my mind, a hallucination brought on by my torment. But the voice persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. It was the voice of a woman, with renewed hope. I listened to her words, letting them guide me through the darkness. She led me through secret passages and hidden doors, showing me a way out of the nightmare that had become my life. As we made our way towards freedom, I could feel the presence of the seller behind us, his rage and fury hot on our heels. But the woman's voice gave me strength, and I fought back with my all, determined to escape his clutches at last. When I burst through the front door of the house, the rain had stopped, and the moon shone down upon me like a beacon of hope. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, and filled with a sense of wonder and relief. The woman was there beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her eyes filled with what seemed as a deep and abiding love. As we stood up and continued to walk away from the house, I could feel a growing sense of unease gnawing at my insides. Something about the whole experience didn't sit right with me. It was then that I heard a strange sound, a low growling noise that seemed to be coming from the shadows behind us. I turned to look, but saw nothing but the darkness of the night. Suddenly, the woman's grip on my shoulder tightened, and I felt a sharp pain in my side. I looked down to see her hand clutching a bloody knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. "What are you doing?" I stammered, my voice filled with fear. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. Her eyes glinted with a mad intensity that made me recoil in horror. "We thought it was time for some cat and mouse action," she said, her face filled with a devilish grin. I tried to run, but I was too weak and her grip was too strong. She dragged me back towards the house, towards the seller who had tormented me for so long. As we entered the darkened hallway, I heard the sound of the seller's footsteps approaching. He appeared from the shadows, a look of triumph on his maniacal face. "Excellent work, my dear," he said, his voice oily with satisfaction. The woman handed me over to him, and he dragged me towards a room at the end of the hallway. As we entered, I saw that it was filled with all manner of torture devices, chains, hooks, knives, and other instruments of horror. I screamed and struggled, but it was no use. The seller bound me to a table as the woman looked on with a cruel smile. Her eyes filled with a terrible madness. The seller began his work, his hands moving with practiced skill as he inflicted unspeakable agony upon my helpless body. The woman watched with a sick fascination, her eyes shining with a demonic glee. As I lay there writhing in agony, I knew that I was doomed. The darkness had claimed me at last, and there was no escape. And as the pain grew ever more intense, I prayed for death to come quickly, to release me from the living nightmare that had become my life. But death did not come, and the horrors continued, until I could take no more. In the end, I was nothing but a broken, mangled shell, a victim of the true evil that had claimed so many before me. And as my consciousness faded away, I knew that I had been consumed by the darkness, and that I would never escape its clutches. Story 2. The Personal Assistant. John had been out of work for several months, and his savings had nearly dried up. He was desperate for a job, so he turned to Craigslist, hoping to find something that would keep him afloat until he could find a better opportunity. One day, while scrolling through the job postings, he came across an ad that caught his eye. Personal assistant needed. Great pay, flexible hours. No experience necessary. The ad didn't provide much information, but it gave an email address for interested candidates to contact. John hesitated for a moment, unsure if he wanted to respond to an anonymous posting on Craigslist. But the promise of good pay and flexible hours was too tempting to pass up. He drafted an email introducing himself and expressing his interest in the position. Within minutes, he received a response from the poster, who called himself Mr. X. Mr. X was cryptic in his response, asking John to meet him at a specific location at 10 p.m. That night, John was uneasy about the late meeting time, but he reminded himself that he needed the money and agreed to go. When he arrived at the designated spot, he found himself in a dimly lit alley. Mr. X was waiting for him, shrouded in a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. Without much preamble, Mr. X launched into an explanation of the job. He needed a personal assistant to help him with various tasks, such as running errands and organizing paperwork. The pay was indeed generous, and the hours were flexible, but Mr. X made it clear that the job would be demanding. John was already feeling uneasy, but something about Mr. X's tone sent shivers down his spine. It was as if the man were trying to intimidate him. Nonetheless, John accepted the job, and Mr. X handed him a thick envelope full of cash as an advance. John's financial worries temporarily assuaged. He turned to leave, but Mr. X stopped him. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You can't tell anyone about this job. Not your family, not your friends, not the police. Nobody. If you do, you'll regret it." John didn't know what to make of the threat, but he nodded and hurried away. He was eager to get out of that alley and away from the creepy man in the black coat. Over the next few days, John settled into his new role as Mr. X's personal assistant. The work was indeed demanding, but the pay was good, and he was able to keep up with his bills. But there was something off about Mr. X. He was rarely seen without his hat and coat, even indoors. He spoke in a clipped, business-like manner, as if he were always in a hurry. John began to suspect that Mr. X was involved in something shady. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt uneasy around the man. One day, John was tasked with going to Mr. X's house to retrieve some paperwork. As he approached the front door, he noticed that the windows were boarded up and the front yard was overgrown and unkept. He rang the doorbell, and after a long pause, Mr. X answered. John was taken aback by the man's appearance. He looked pale and haggard, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. Mr. X handed him a file folder and told him to leave. John could tell that something was very wrong. He considered quitting on the spot, but decided to stick it out a little longer, hoping to find out what was going on. The next day, John received a text from Mr. X, asking him to meet him at a park on the outskirts of town. The text was short and cryptic, but John felt that he had no choice but to go. When he arrived at the park, he saw Mr. X sitting on a bench, his coat and hat discarded on the ground beside him. He looked even worse than he had the day before, and John could see dark circles under his eyes. "Something's happened," Mr. X said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help." John was taken aback by the sudden change in tone. Mr. X had never shown any vulnerability before, and John realized that he had no idea who this man really was. "What happened?" John asked, trying to sound calm. Mr. X took a deep breath and began to speak in a shaky voice. He told John that he had been involved in some sort of illegal activity and that he had made a mistake. He had crossed someone, and now that person was coming after him. "I need to disappear," Mr. X said, his eyes darting around nervously. "But I can't do it alone. I need someone to help me." John was starting to feel scared now. He didn't want to get involved in anything illegal, but he was also worried about what would happen if he said no. "What do you need me to do?" John asked reluctantly. Mr. X explained that he had a plan. He had arranged for a fake passport and identity, and he had a stash of money that he could use to start a new life. But he needed someone to help him get out of town and disappear without a trace. "I need you to drive me to the airport," Mr. X said, "and then I need you to disappear too." John was stunned. He had never imagined that things would escalate to this level. He knew that if he helped Mr. X, he would be complicit in his illegal activities. "I can't do this," John said, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry." Mr. X's expression turned cold. "You don't have a choice," he said. "If you don't help me, I'll make sure you regret it." John knew then that he had made a terrible mistake by getting involved with this man. He tried to turn and run, but Mr. X was faster. He grabbed John by the arm and dragged him into the nearby woods. John struggled, but he was no match for Mr. X's strength. He realized with horror that he had fallen into a trap. Mr. X led him deeper into the woods, where he had dug a shallow grave. John could see the glint of a shovel in the moonlight. "I'm sorry it had to end like this," Mr. X said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But you know too much." John tried to plead with him, to reason with him, but it was no use. Mr. X hit him over the head with the shovel, and everything went black. When John woke up, he was buried up to his chest in the shallow grave. His hands and feet were bound, and he could barely move. He heard Mr. X's voice in the distance, muttering to himself as he dug another hole nearby. John knew that his time was running out. He struggled to break free, but it was no use. He was trapped, and he knew that he was going to die. As Mr. X approached him with the shovel, John closed his eyes and prayed. But it was too late. The last thing he heard was the sound of dirt hitting his face, and then everything went dark.